Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Renewable Energy Movement, powered by GreenGo. Today's guest is Nick Lagrilliere. I'll check in a moment if I've pronounced that correctly. Nick's background, as ever, is quite unique, quite interesting. Graduated from the University of Aberdeen in petroleum geoscience, went on to work for Maersk and Total in the oil and gas industry before eventually finding himself here in the renewable space, where he spent the last 5 years or so working for GreenGo Energy Group, and he's now the European Director of Project Delivery. How was that, Nick, for an introduction? Maybe you want to add anything?
No, it sounds pretty spot on, Tom. Maybe just a detail, but based in Copenhagen, Denmark. For the international audience that undoubtedly will be listening to this, so that's maybe also a reference point.
Yeah, good one. Forgot to add that. We've kept ourselves multicultural with a guest from Denmark this time. And so yeah, thanks for mentioning. Yeah, I suppose that we can start at the very beginning. Nick, like the start of your career and the migration towards renewables. I mean, it's a pretty big change, I would say.
Yeah, I think it's certainly a bit unconventional to have someone with a subsurface oil and gas background working in solar PV and the renewable energy space in general. But I think, starting in oil and gas for me at that time, at least 15 years seems like a while ago, but it was more all energies needed kind of approach. I think the whole discussion around climate change was still relatively muted at the time, and so it was more about securing access to affordable energy to help improve people's living standards. For me, oil and gas at that point was, let's say, technically interesting, and thus I ended up rolling into that through the University of Aberdeen, as you mentioned. But then I think around 5 years ago, also by external circumstances to some extent, but I had the opportunity to maybe pursue a different direction and wanted to pivot more towards the renewable energy space. I think, Denmark, and in particular maybe Copenhagen, of course, there's a lot of players in that field, and Denmark itself is perhaps a little bit further along the energy transition journey than some other places, which of course also makes that a little bit easier. But so it happened somewhat organically, I want to say, and actually more driven by the content of the job that I was initially offered at GreenGo and the fact that it is renewable energy more than anything else, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. And I suppose a couple of questions on the very beginning. It seems from your studies that you were always not destined but keen to be in the field of kind of geoscience. Is that?
Well, I think I've always sort of had an engineering component to that as well, but obviously not electrical engineering. But yeah, I mean, it's an interesting discipline in the sense that it integrates a lot of different fields, and then especially if you go a bit more broadly on the subsurface side. So that integrative thinking, I think in the pure sense in geoscience across space and time, is certainly something that wires your brain perhaps in a certain way. And I've actually found that quite helpful when approaching project management as well, because in the end it is about how in the end different work streams, different timelines and different disciplines collaborate to deliver projects. So it's using the same kind of philosophy and thinking in a very different way, I suppose.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm sure since you've probably seen a lot of people that have made a similar shift across. I think it's relatively common now, all the way down from the kind of engineering side, but to the senior project managers, you'll find people that have got significant oil and gas background that have now found themselves in renewables. Yeah,
I was actually speaking to a former colleague a couple of weeks ago who's based in Norway, and he quipped that essentially everyone he knows has either gone into renewables or carbon capture and storage. Yeah. So it's definitely heading in that direction, especially I think here in Europe. That's a pretty strong trend at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it. I asked you offline just now what was your first job in renewables? Was it Total or was it GreenGo? And the reason I asked that question was that, of course, Total are actually investing quite a lot of time and money and effort in their renewables function as well now. So there's a lot of crossover within companies as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think they also had the very clear goal to adhere to the EIA 2-degree scenario, right? So I think that also matches with what they were doing with their portfolio at the time. Yeah, and still are, by the way, both in Denmark and internationally. Yeah.
Okay, and when you said I think you mentioned it was more on the job that came available or the job was offered to you. What was it that pulled you into the renewable space? Yeah, what was it to make that shift?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost it was probably driven by, let's say, personal values. If you're the kind of person who's trying to save energy at home, recycles, etc., does all the things that are right, then I think for me personally, I think let's say the cognitive dissonance that exists between at that point working in oil and gas and that more personal approach to taking climate change and the energy transition quite seriously. So I think at that point I was like, well, okay, maybe I should find a bit more alignment between what I'm doing and what I think is important for us right now and for future generations. So I think it was partly value based. And then regarding the job specifically, I think over the years I sort of figured out that, integration is what makes me tick, and that technical project management in particular is something that I really enjoyed. And I actually recall the conversation that I had with the recruiter for the job at GreenGo, which was for EPC project manager, which sort of centered around, okay, the job description is exactly what I want to be doing, but are you sure it's for a solar PV developer in Denmark? Because at the time, I think it was very incipient in Denmark at the best of times, and we all know what the climate in Scandinavia is.
Yeah.
So it was driven by a mix of let's say a personal view on these matters, and then of course at the same time opportunity, right? Which also has to come around at the right time.
And just on that, so you've essentially seen, or you've been presented a job opportunity that essentially is exactly what you want to be doing. But how was it making the jump with what I would imagine kind of some limited experience in what that customer was looking for?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks to the hiring manager at the time, who of course wanted to take that leap as well, although I think he also had a bit of a different background, being a physicist himself. So I think it was challenging in a way, but in a positive way, I want to say, because it really focuses around one of these often used words, which is, transferable skills. And of course you are really playing catch up on the technical side more than anything. I think a lot of the project management, financial, process-related topics, I mean, that is very transferable. But I think what I did realize early on was that this jump from having grown into technical project management in, let's say, the oil and gas industry, where you started in a technical role and then sort of built upon that, was very different from having to try and apply the same in a field where you're not going to be the technical expert, which at least I was in some of the disciplines that I was trying to manage when I was in the oil and gas realm. So that was certainly a challenge. But I mean, I personally am someone who likes a learning curve. And so, through, let's say, osmosis, by working with the engineering and procurement teams, etc., of course, you try and get up the learning curve as soon as possible. I always think it's more about being able to ask the critical questions more than necessarily doing the detailed technical work yourself. So I think there's always a balance to strike there as a PM anyway. Yeah,
I completely agree. And it's a challenge that, owning a recruitment company, we come across quite often. The solar PV industry in Denmark in 2021 couldn't have had that many people that had the correct project management experience as well as the technical experience, because they simply didn't exist. How do you navigate those potential staff shortages in your role now?
Yeah, so I think what you're pointing at is absolutely true, right? I think if you're in an industry that is experiencing, at least until quite recently was experiencing, rapid growth, perhaps that pushes people to think a bit more creatively about what people can bring to the table that isn't just homegrown within the respective industry. So that's certainly helped. I think with the delays that we are seeing on projects across, portfolio, the Scandinavian and the European market, of course, that has also translated itself in a slowdown with regard to recruitment. So I think for now, that's not really an issue that is posing itself too much, but hopefully it's something that will make a reappearance in the not too distant future when we figure out how to start accelerating the transition again. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely interesting to try and navigate in what is essentially a skills shortage market, not just in solar, but I think Denmark, given its general labor market, you're always struggling to find the right talent because of the low unemployment rate, etc.
Yeah, indeed. So then, I suppose, moving a little bit more detailed into your journey with GreenGo, you've obviously been with them, I think, about 5 years now. Is that right?
Yeah, just about 4.5, I think. Yeah.
How has your journey kind of evolved with them? I think you began with focusing only on the market in Denmark, and that's potentially progressed into a more European-facing role. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So I joined as EPC project manager 4.5 years ago, and that was actually to start construction on the first project that the company was doing, at least utility scale, that the company was doing in Denmark. So I think to some extent that was a learning curve for me, but also for the organization. They just wrapped up a number of projects in the US and were then essentially coming back to the Danish market, but in utility scale, and trying to implement that. So pushing that first project through, and then taking on progressively larger projects, right? At the time we were looking at 10 megawatts, and then it scaled to 30, 60, and now if you look below 100 megawatt, then it's it's becoming less attractive. So I think things have moved very fast and scaled very fast in the last 4.5 years. But yeah, so I essentially had the opportunity to work on some interesting and increasing in size projects. And then about a year and a half ago now, then take over as project delivery director, responsible for our, let's say, ready to build projects in the European market, where we're now also active in Latvia, and hopefully some other countries will follow shortly. It's been and it's been fascinating from a growth point of view as well, because with a background in what are essentially large multinational corporations, joining a company where the team that I joined at that point had 2 or 3 employees, whereas each of the letters in EPC now essentially have more than that discipline-wise. So I think that growth's been very fascinating. But now, of course, it's to see how we can make that work again in the changed market conditions that we're currently facing.
Yeah, really interesting. A couple of questions out of that. I would say, firstly, how many projects do you think you've overseen now with GreenGo, and what's been the biggest in size?
Biggest one we've executed so far is 60 megawatt.
Yeah, great stuff. Interesting. And then just on the team size, I mean, so how has the team grown exactly in terms of personnel since you joined in March 2021?
Yeah, I mean, essentially more engineering resources, of course, especially on the project engineering side. Growth also on supply chain and procurement to manage all the different contracts. And then, finally now heading a team of, a couple of project managers, and until recently also construction managers. So it's been, it was at least growth across the board, which was interesting to experience.
And are they all based as well in Denmark, or have you got a European-wide team?
Most based in Denmark. Of course, for Latvia, we also have local resources for the construction and to some extent project management side of things.
Okay. This question might also lean on some of your experience you've had earlier in your career when you worked in Scotland and I think the States as well. How do you find working kind of cross-culturally? How do you find managing teams kind of cross-culturally? Is there anything that you've picked up that enables you to do that better, let's say, than others?
Yeah, well, I think nothing like learning by doing and learning from experience, which has definitely been a big part of that. And despite us not being a very large company, what actually surprised me, because one of the things that I worried about losing was sort of the international angle coming from the large multinational companies, but we actually are very diverse especially on the EPC side, in GreenGo as well. So at least already at the team level, we have quite a few nationalities represented. And then, of course, if you start counting suppliers, contractors, subcontractors, then you very quickly start to have a global footprint. In addition to that, our engineering team is actually, or at least design and engineering team is actually based in Puebla in Mexico for, let's say, somewhat historic reasons. So yeah, that cross-cultural element was certainly not lost when I joined GreenGo Energy. But I think a lot of the cross-cultural experiences that help you do this are a little bit organic, right? Like I myself am originally from Belgium, Anders specifically, so I guess that's a bit more sort of Germanic slant, as you might know, also living in the Netherlands now. Yeah. And then I think, already the cultural difference with the UK was interesting, just in terms of your communication style, how direct or indirect things are being said, how implicit or explicit things are being coordinated. So there's a lot of layers to that onion. And interestingly, I think then moving back to Denmark, which you could say arguably is culturally closer to Flanders than it is to the UK, mm-hmm. I did have a little bit of sort of cultural whiplash going both ways, because suddenly the things that I think I possibly offended a few British colleagues with at the start, I was the one who felt offended moving here. It's like, how could you be so direct about these things, So I think it's a lot about learning by doing and just exposure. And yeah, of course, awareness goes a long way, right? People's communication styles are different, people's cultural baggage, and trying to make that work to the best of your abilities, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I resonate completely with what you've just said. Especially on that cultural whiplash point. Of course, I'm British, but I've been in the Netherlands for a while now, so I'm fully up to speed with the Dutch communication style, let's say. But we have a lot of customers that are in Italy or Spain, and again, their communication differs as well. Especially if I'm involved, it's in English, so it's outside of their mother tongue. And my Italian colleague has pulled me up a couple of times for like being almost insensitive on an email, just for being a more Dutch style, let's say.
Yeah, no beating around the bush.
No beating around the bush at all. No, exactly. Just moving into staying on your current role with GreenGo. You mentioned some work in Latvia, a potential for some other countries across Europe. Where do you see kind of, let's say, growth or emerging markets in the next couple of years across Europe and Scandinavia?
I think one of the key questions right now is, of course, how we deal with the current situation commercially, and I think to some extent also from a permitting point of view, right? Because essentially the bottlenecks right now are low PPA prices and price curves that aren't looking very attractive. You've got grid constraints, quite complex permitting, and of course, I think it's no secret everyone is looking at BESS as a way to mitigate some or all of those issues. So I think it's very clear that that push towards BESS will continue by the market. It's also what you could have anticipated, I guess, looking at markets like Spain, California, that are a lot more mature already. So that's clearly a trend that's here to stay, that the whole market is pursuing, of course. But in terms of market growth, I mean, in the end, I think there's also a not insignificant political and regulatory component to all of this, which needs to be part of the solution. Because unless we accelerate, and when I say we as society, and primarily then also thinking of sort of the political realm, unless we streamline some of these processes and accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, it's quite clear that we're not going to make the Paris goals by a long shot if you look at where the current forecasts are taking us. So I think a lot of political intervention is needed as well to make this work. So right now, I think with the level of uncertainty that you face, answering your question is actually very difficult because there's a lot up in the air at the moment and people are trying to find technical, commercial and regulatory solutions to the issues that I mentioned. So pretty complex picture, I would say, at the moment.
Yeah, and it all like politically, specifically, as we're on that topic, it all differs in relatively short periods of time as well, depending on what the electoral system is in whatever country. An administration could be, I guess, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. I'm not up to speed with all of Europeans' political structures, like I mentioned, but that can quite significantly hamper that particular country for that period of time. How is the outlook in Scandinavia, in Denmark at the moment?
Yeah, so I think the Scandinavian market, and in particular Denmark, is indeed suffering from the issues that I just mentioned earlier. To some extent, somehow, apparently, we are still on track as a country, at least, to meet the reduction targets for 2030. I think it's starting to get a little bit cloudier beyond that, but with the current progress of things, I think I can't imagine that we can keep staying on track towards, 70% reduction by 2030. I think the national goal is here. So yeah, here I think things are definitely having a slowdown. At the same time, luckily, there is some political discussion in this realm. I want to say almost unfortunately also focus a lot on the offshore wind. Of course, that's a very well-established industry in Denmark with, quite a bit of support now from the taxpayer and the government going to offshore. Whereas I think, unfortunately, on the onshore solar and wind deployment, I think we've perhaps seen a move in the opposite direction, where unfortunately things have become quite a bit more expensive in terms of being able to grid connect your renewable energy plants over the last several years. And yeah, that streamlining of the permitting process is perhaps not quite there yet either. So for now, I think the Danish market, remains challenging. But again, looking at technical and commercial solutions there to try and navigate around some of this is what I think all players are trying to do.
Governmentally, is the Danish government currently in favour of and backing renewables, or are they becoming a little bit more of a sticking point, let's say?
I think the Danish government is still backing renewables, and they're doing it quite explicitly also for the offshore wind sector. I think the, let's say, more direct support for onshore renewables is the one that is perhaps less visible at the moment. It's also related to the way tariffs are set up, for example, in terms of grid connection, which essentially has become more expensive over the last several years, which again leads to a selection in the project portfolios towards larger projects, right? Which then perhaps are difficult from a local community acceptance point of view. So although one of the positive measures that was recently announced is Denmark actually has one of the highest, distribution fees for electricity for consumers. And they're actually for the next 2 years here taking the initiative now from the government to drop that to the European minimum, which will represent a significant saving for the consumers. Because in the end, I think you can say that we have been a victim of our own success in the renewable sector by deploying a lot of capacity quite fast. Unfortunately, the transition to electrical consumption hasn't really kept up with that. So, of course, stimulating the demand and moving away from fossil fuels towards more electrification will also be part of the solution, right? So we're seeing some moves in that direction at least. So yeah, I think direct support for offshore wind, we're seeing these measures around electricity consumption as well. So yeah, I think they're supporting the transition, but unfortunately not, perhaps not quite enough.
Yeah, I hear you. You make a good point on the consumer. I mean, if you speak to people, which I'm sure you do, like I do, that are not in the industry, that tends to be their biggest qualm, let's say, or biggest concern is that the fact that they might be utilizing solar or utilizing even an EV vehicle, but the price reduction doesn't really hit them. It's almost like where's the benefit for us?
Yeah, I guess the disadvantage for the consumer is that you pay for the most expensive electron, regardless of what the rest of the energy mix that is feeding into the grid looks like. So that unfortunately doesn't always translate into immediate savings. And I think that's a little bit an irony that you see across the board. Also, when you think, for example, of transportation options, right? If you're not having sales tax on kerosene, but you are having it on electricity to power the national rail network, then already there, of course, perhaps that's not incentivizing the right behavior. And thus, again, doing the right thing is not the cheapest option for the consumer, which in the end, I think, logically drives a lot of people's choices and behavior. So I think, also, again, back to the policy level, rationalizing some of those incentives and disincentives would perhaps also go a long way towards incentivizing the transition more.
Yeah, exactly. You're relying on morals, and I think it's fair to say that there's also a certain level, a certain class that cannot just rely on morals. That economically is the be all and end all. Will therefore go for the cheapest option.
Yep, exactly.
You've mentioned it. Obviously, it's on everyone's lips, but kind of battery storage a couple of times during this conversation. And interestingly, you also mentioned at the very start, referring to Norway around some kind of carbon capture and carbon projects. How multi-utility is obviously going to be the way forward. How advanced do you think we can go on that?
Well, I'm by no means a technical expert in the field, of course, but it's pretty obvious from both an project economics point of view, but also just simply optimal use of the grid infrastructure. Also from a CapEx point of view, that hybrid wind, solar, BESS is the logical combination, all other things being equal. How you are able to implement that, again, from a permitting point of view, how those timelines differ between the different technologies. And then, of course, depending on the country where you are, what the potential is for, wind versus solar and a combination of both. That, of course, varies widely. But I think it's clear that if you look at it from an integration point of view, then the combination of the three, I think, is clearly the preferred solution.
Yeah, indeed. I suppose just coming towards the end now, Nick, and trying to wrap up on a couple of things. A couple of questions. Firstly, what advice would you give somebody that was in similar shoes to you, that's looking to transition to the solar PV or renewable space?
Yeah, I think I touched a little bit on the transferable skills side of things. I think I by no means would advise someone to jump haphazardly. I think if you're a little bit clear on the place where you want to land, and that's perhaps partially the company, but more so the kind of roles that you would envisage for yourself, then of course already sort of laying the groundwork for that in your current career is probably the advisable way to go. I did that similarly, right? I was already doing technical project management in a different kind of, industry engineering, and then that makes it easier to carry that across into different industries. Yeah, try to lay the groundwork, and at the same time having a little bit of faith in your transferable skills once you've done that to make the leap and explore those opportunities is perhaps my advice then to people considering doing something similar.
Yeah, hopefully find that golden job spec that's got your name written on it.
Yeah, I mean, luck and timing are of course part of the equation, right?
And then I suppose the next one, again, we've touched upon this a little bit as well, but looking into the future and the next couple of years with kind of GreenGo. How do you see that going?
Interesting, because of course, we as a company are subject to the same turbulence that the rest of the market is subject to. I think, recently looking in the media, of course, we have some interesting projects also in the Power-to-X realm. that are receiving some coverage, our megaton concept, if you like. And then hopefully, I think our international expansion, I think it's public knowledge that we are also in France, and then, well, Sweden right now. Haven't seen any project reach ready to build yet, but hopefully that market will be following as well. So yeah, there's at least some positive developments there. And meanwhile, I think, weathering the storm like everyone else by trying to find those technical and commercial solutions that I was alluding to before is what we're keeping ourselves busy with. Yeah.
Yeah, exciting. So some potential expansion across different parts of Europe. So yeah, watch this space. We'll put the links. Nick's quite active on LinkedIn as well, or can be quite active on LinkedIn. So we'll put the links of Nick's LinkedIn in the description, as well as the same for GreenGo Energy Group if you'd like to read up. And yeah, thanks very much for coming on. Really enjoyed the discussion. Yeah, we'll speak soon.
Thanks for having me.
Cheers.